For decades, the number didn't make sense. 30 murders would have already placed someone among the most notorious serial killers in history. 40 would be almost unimaginable. But 93? That number sounded impossible. And yet the man sitting quietly across from investigators insisted it was the truth. He didn't shout. He didn't brag. He didn't even seem nervous. Instead, he calmly described faces, cities, nights that had happened decades earlier. Women no one had been looking for. Victims who had died so quietly that many of their deaths were never even treated as murders. For years, they had been dismissed as overdoses, or accidents, or simply forgotten. But the man telling these stories claimed he remembered every one of them. His name was Samuel Little, and investigators were about to discover something terrifying. If he was telling the truth, he might be the most prolific serial killer in American history. Samuel Little's story began on June 7, 1940. He was born in the small town of Reynolds, Georgia, but from the very beginning, stability was absent. His mother reportedly worked as a prostitute and struggled to raise him. Within months of his birth, Samuel was left in the care of his grandmother. She lived in Lorain, Ohio, an industrial town on the edge of Lake Erie. That's where he grew up, and it's where many people later wondered if the warning signs had already begun. Teachers described him as quiet, withdrawn, sometimes strange. He had difficulty in school and frequently clashed with authority. But there was something else people noticed. Samuel had a fascination with women, not a typical teenage curiosity, something darker. He would later confess that even as a young boy, he felt urges he couldn't explain, urges tied to violence. But no one around him knew that yet. At the time, he was just another troubled kid growing up in a struggling industrial city. By the time he reached his teenage years, Samuel Little was already drifting. Petty crime, shoplifting, trouble with the law. Nothing that suggested the scale of what he would eventually become. Just small offenses, small warnings, warnings that no one fully understood. In 1957, at just 17 years old, Samuel Little was arrested for the first time. The charge was burglary. It wouldn't be the last. Over the next several decades, his criminal record would grow into a long list of arrests. Assault, theft, fraud, drug charges. But strangely, murder was never among them. Not yet. For a time, Little joined the military. He served briefly in the United States Army, but the structure didn't last. His time in the Army ended in trouble, and once again he found himself drifting. From city to city, state to state, sometimes working odd jobs, sometimes committing small crimes, often disappearing entirely. The pattern was becoming clear. Samuel Little was living a life without roots, and that kind of life made it very easy to vanish. But it also made it very easy to hide something much darker. Because while police records tracked his arrests, they had no idea what else he might have been doing between them. By the early 1970s, Samuel Little had begun traveling constantly. He moved across the country, from Florida to California to Texas, and dozens of other cities in between. He stayed in cheap motels, sometimes homeless shelters, sometimes in cars. It was a transient lifestyle, but investigators would later realize something important. This constant movement gave him something incredibly dangerous: anonymity. Because during those years, there was no national database connecting crimes across states. Police departments worked independently. A murder in one city had no automatic connection to a murder in another, and Samuel Little moved through those gaps like a ghost. His victims were almost always the same type: women on the margins of society, sex workers, drug users, women who were already vulnerable. Women whose disappearances might not attract immediate attention. He would meet them in bars, on streets, or near highways. He often offered them rides, sometimes alcohol, sometimes drugs. Then, when they were alone, he attacked. Samuel Little didn't use weapons. No guns, no knives. He used his hands. Manual strangulation. It left very little forensic evidence. No bullet casings, no stab wounds. Often just bruising, sometimes mistaken for injuries related to overdoses or accidents. That detail alone allowed him to evade detection for decades. Because if investigators didn't recognize a death as homicide, there would be no murder investigation. And if there was no murder investigation, Samuel Little would simply move on. By the mid-1970s, Samuel Little had already killed multiple women, possibly dozens. But the pattern remained invisible. The victims often lived on the edges of society. Many struggled with addiction. Many had unstable housing. Some had no close family. When they disappeared, people noticed, but their cases rarely received national attention. And when bodies were discovered, the conclusions were often tragic but simple. Drug overdose, natural causes, exposure. Cases were closed. Files were stored, and Samuel Little kept traveling. He later described his victims with chilling precision. Hair color, clothing, the layout of streets where he met them, even the music playing in bars decades earlier. It was as if every murder had been carefully cataloged in his memory. But no one knew that yet. For nearly 40 years, Samuel Little would continue moving through American cities unnoticed. And with every passing year, the number of victims quietly grew. The arrest that changed everything. In 2012, something unexpected happened. Samuel Little was arrested in Kentucky. The charge wasn't murder. It was drugs, a relatively small case. But routine procedures required that his DNA be entered into a national database. And that's when everything changed. The DNA matched evidence from 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles. 3 women, 3 cold cases. Suddenly, investigators had something they had never had before. A direct link. Samuel Little was extradited to California. And in 2014, he was convicted. 3 murders, 3 life sentences. For most killers, that would have been the end of the story. But in Samuel Little's case, it was only the beginning. Because once investigators began questioning him, they realized something terrifying. The 3 murders they had proven might only be a tiny fraction of the truth. When Samuel Little was convicted in 2014 for 3 murders in Los Angeles, investigators believed they had closed an important case. 3 victims finally had justice. But the man sitting in prison didn't behave like someone whose story was finished. He didn't seem relieved. He didn't seem defeated. Instead, he appeared calm, almost comfortable. And that made some investigators uneasy, because seasoned detectives know something about serial killers. The ones who commit multiple murders rarely stop talking forever. Sometimes they brag, sometimes they manipulate, and sometimes they confess. But usually, there are always more stories beneath the surface. And Samuel Little seemed like a man carrying far more than 3. The FBI interviews. In 2018, investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation decided to try something unusual. They sent a criminal analyst named James Holland to interview Little in prison. Holland specialized in violent offenders. He had spent years studying serial killers. But he also knew something important. If you want a killer to talk, you cannot treat the conversation like an interrogation. You have to let them tell their story. So when Holland sat down with Samuel Little, he didn't accuse him. He didn't threaten him. Instead, he simply asked questions. About the past. About cities. About memories. And slowly, Samuel Little began talking. The number that shocked everyone. At first, the stories came slowly. A woman in one city. Another in a different state. A memory from the 1970s. Then the 1980s. Then another decade. Each story followed a similar pattern. A bar. A street corner. A vulnerable woman. And a violent attack. At one point, the investigator asked a simple question. How many? Samuel Little thought for a moment. Then he answered, 93. 93 murders. The room went quiet. Because if that number was real, it would make him the deadliest serial killer in American history. More than killers like Ted Bundy. More than John Wayne Gacy. More than anyone investigators had ever documented before. But confessions alone are not enough. Investigators needed proof. That's when Samuel Little did something extraordinary. He asked for art supplies, paper, colored pencils, and he began drawing, one face at a time. women he claimed to have killed decades earlier. The details were haunting. Different hairstyles, different expressions, different skin tones. Each portrait captured a person he said he remembered clearly. The drawings were then released publicly by the FBI, and something remarkable began happening. Families started recognizing them. A daughter recognized a missing mother. A sister recognized a face from decades ago. Cold cases that had sat untouched for 30 or 40 years suddenly had new leads. And slowly, investigators began confirming what once seemed impossible. Samuel Little had been telling the truth. One question haunted investigators. How could someone commit so many murders without being caught? The answer wasn't simple. It was a combination of several factors. First, his victims were often invisible to the system. Many were sex workers. Many struggled with addiction. Many lived transient lives. When they disappeared, their cases didn't always receive immediate attention. Second, Samuel Little constantly moved. Across highways, across state lines, from city to city. A murder in Texas had no obvious connection to a murder in Florida, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. There were no centralized databases, no instant communication between police departments nationwide. And third, his method left almost no evidence. Manual strangulation. No weapon. Often no witnesses. Sometimes no obvious trauma. Many deaths were ruled overdoses or accidents. And with each mistaken conclusion, Samuel Little walked away again. During interviews, investigators noticed something chilling. Samuel Little remembered details most people would forget in days. He described clothing colors from 40 years earlier. He remembered the layout of bars that no longer existed. He described highways and intersections with precision. Sometimes investigators tested him. They would ask about a city where they suspected he might have killed someone. Little would close his eyes and start describing the streets, the weather, the car he was driving, then the woman. It was like watching someone replay memories from a dark archive in his mind, an archive built from violence. As investigators reviewed his confessions, something incredible happened. Cold cases began reopening across the United States. Murders in the 1970s, cases from the 1980s, unidentified victims from decades ago. Some were confirmed through DNA, others through forensic evidence, and some through details only the killer could know. Eventually, authorities confirmed 60 murders, making Samuel Little officially the most prolific serial killer in American history. But even investigators believe the real number might be closer to his original confession. 93. Samuel Little spent the rest of his life in prison in California. Even in his late 70s, he continued speaking with investigators, occasionally providing new clues, sometimes correcting earlier memories. He seemed oddly willing to discuss his crimes, not with remorse, but with a strange calmness, as if the memories were simply stories he had been carrying for decades. Stories that now finally had listeners. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little died in prison at the age of 80. His death closed one chapter of the investigation, but not the entire story, because many of the women he described still remain unidentified. Some families are still waiting for answers, and investigators continue working through the confessions he left behind. Samuel Little spent nearly half a century moving quietly through American cities. Most people who crossed his path never suspected what he was capable of. To them, he was just another man passing through. But hidden behind that ordinary appearance was something far darker. A man responsible for dozens of deaths. Women whose stories might never have been told if he had not finally spoken. Even today, investigators continue studying his case, not just to identify the remaining victims, but to understand how such a massive pattern of violence went unnoticed for so long. Because the story of Samuel Little isn't just about one killer. It's about the cracks in the system, the vulnerable people who fall through those cracks, and the decades it sometimes takes for the truth to finally surface.